Even after all these years, I still get a lot of hate for saying that I liked Final Fantasy XIII, and there's a lot of franchises that I like that have that sort of toxic following, which is fairly unfortunate, such as the Sonic franchise. I like the majority of the Sonic games, and I like the Neptunia franchise, for God's sake. But at the same time, I realize, even though I like these franchises, I realize they are games with flaws, and I don't necessarily kind of think that the hate towards some of them is not unwarranted, and there are problems. I'm a person who can look at a game and be like, I like this, but it does have these flaws with it, and I think that because I like these games, I actually have a nice sort of perspective on it, where I'm like, I enjoy this, and I would want it to be better, and so I might actually be a little bit more critical of things, but at the same time, I'm still able to enjoy it because I don't indulge in that hate. And Final Fantasy XIII is a very interesting study in this, because when it originally launched, it had an initial kind of positive reaction, as it is a Final Fantasy game, and it is a fantastic one at that. It also has some major problems, and people kind of latched onto that, and it created this huge toxic following to where people that never even played the game or even seen it at the time were kind of spouting about it, being like, this is the worst game ever made, nobody should ever play it, it's terrible, and what has Square Enix done, and all this other types of stuff. And it didn't only involve just like a negativism for the game, but it also had a lot of negative aspects towards the community as well, to where even today, if I mention that I like Final Fantasy XIII in any public forum, I will get massive amounts of hate. I've even had death threats sent over Twitter over the fact that I liked Final Fantasy XIII, and I'm not the only one that has had that happen. If you are somebody who is out there being like, I'm going to send this guy a death threat because he likes a game that I don't like, for one, you're pathetic. And number two, it's absolutely ridiculous that game was able to kind of conjure up that sort of feeling in people. And I'm not necessarily sure why or how, but we're not going to analyze that today. Instead, what we're going to analyze is Final Fantasy XIII. Michael here with Design View, and we're going to be talking about how Final Fantasy XIII is not actually a bad game. Yes, it has problems, and we'll obviously be covering those. In fact, that's going to be the majority of the video, is just talking about major problems with it. But at the same time, I want to talk about how it's also not a bad game, and kind of talk about the perspective and the misinterpretations that we actually had during this game, because once again, it is an interesting study. If you go back and look at reviews, they've ended up doing all these other kind of re-reviews of the game and being like, maybe it wasn't that bad. And a lot of critics have kind of said like, yeah, we kind of just put out a lot of hate because it was selling. And so, yeah, and a lot of people have been saying they regret it and stuff like that. So it's very, very interesting. Anyways, let's go ahead and go into the settings real quick. I need to change a few things because I am just going to start a new game, and for some reason, it does some things. So it makes it so it auto goes onto auto battle. Actually, this is my normal settings, except for this needs to be on controller. Maybe it'll work when I go into a new game. The settings save with your save file, and so, yeah, this is the PC port, by the way. First major critical point of the game, the performance on it, on literally absolutely everything, is god abysmal. It is just absolutely terrible. It dips below 20 FPS on console, and on PC, unless you have an absolute beast of a machine, it will drop like crazy because everything processes on a single CPU thread, which is asinine. I don't know why they didn't actually take any sort of time into porting it over whatsoever, but that's what they decided to do, and so at least we could play it on PC. It's still, on my machine, it runs at a pretty solid 60 FPS, but at the same time, on most machines, it's going to dip pretty dang low, which is very, very unfortunate. And even my machine, which is a freaking expensive as hell machine, still drops frames every once in a while. It's very, very obnoxious. But I'm just going to be playing through the game from the very start and skipping all the cutscenes that I possibly can, because basically I don't want to spoil anything, but I do want to show a little bit of gameplay in the background. So let's go ahead and talk about my personal preferences for Final Fantasy XIII, because a lot of the hate that I see towards Final Fantasy XIII is mostly personal preference stuff. Like, let's say they don't like the characters, for example. They're like, oh, well, the characters are boring and bland. That is mostly personal preference, because I personally didn't like characters like, such as Cloud, for example. People were like, I love Cloud. And it's like, I thought he was boring, and I kind of didn't really like him. Or, for example, Titus, or literally the entire cast of Final Fantasy X. I did not enjoy it. I'm like, I don't really care for him. But at the same time, other Final Fantasies I've actually enjoyed that other people have not, for example. And so a lot of that type of stuff, personal preference. But there are two major problems that I actually have with Final Fantasy XIII, and these come down to being incredibly major flaws. And so the first one ends up coming down to its actual storytelling. Now, the world of Final Fantasy XIII actually takes place in the Crystallis Nova universe, or whatever, that they ended up building for this game. And it actually goes into all the 13 games. It was going to go into Final Fantasy Versus, which turned into 15. And we actually see that in a bit of it. I can talk about that a little bit later near the end of the video. And then it also took place during Type 0, and they had a few little spin-off things that also took place inside of the world. So it is an entire world built with a ton of lore and a ton of interesting kind of aspects to the world. For example, it has these gods called the Fal'Cie and everything, and it's actually really, really cool. However, the game does nothing to explain that to you besides putting in codex entries, which I believe I can go down here, go to data log. Oh, look, I can read about events and things like that. And so, like, if I want to go to enemy intel, for example, and I want to read about the military units and actually learn about them at all, I have to go through the codexes and actually read about all their sort of lore and stuff like that, which is very upsetting. And it kind of makes it difficult to follow the story if you don't actually pay attention. It's very, very easy to miss the story. And it also does this thing to where it ends up having a cast of characters, just like any other Final Fantasy game. But it also does this thing to where it kind of focuses on one character or one specific duo of characters at a specific point, which once again makes a situation to where the story can be a little bit hard to follow when it ends up swapping between characters, and it makes it so that certain characters don't seem to develop, and it makes it so that certain parts of the world, for example, don't seem like they develop either, because it'll focus on one specific aspect. It's like, oh, well, this is going to focus on this specific aspect of this specific place, and then basically it doesn't focus on anything else around that, and so it kind of feels like it's in an empty shell in that specific scenario. Now, as a whole, it works perfectly fine, and if you actually follow the story, everything does make sense, and I find it fairly enjoyable. Not everyone does, but at the same time, I found it fairly interesting. There's a lot of lore to end up liking here, and that is my major complaint there, is it's mostly a disappointment for that. And then also on the gameplay front, the game is fairly linear for the most part. It is about just like any other Final Fantasy game, to where basically 80% of the game is all linear corridors with story in between, and then all of a sudden, you get this open world that has a bunch of challenges and stuff like that. And Final Fantasy XIII actually has quite a fair few number of challenges. They have these things called hunts near the end of the game that you can do that can actually be fairly challenging and are fairly fun as well. And so I actually enjoyed that, and I actually enjoy the combat and stuff like that. But one of the major aspects is that this game was actually designed near the beginning of the PS3 and 360 era, and I remember it getting delayed like several years. And they're like, oh yeah, well, we need to delay it for this reason and that reason and stuff like that. And basically, it was designed to be almost a launch title, which means that it was kind of banking on that idea of being cinematic and being special and showing off everyone what this tech can do and what the new Final Fantasies will look like. And yeah, while the game, fairly visually impressive, and I love this background, it did end up kind of running into a lot of limitations, especially, I mentioned those performance problems on literally everything. The engine itself is not able to handle a lot. This is actually pushing the limits of the hardware at the time, and so basically they just ran into a lot of technical problems that were making it so that the game had to be fairly linear, not only for story aspects, but also because the game was trying to be cinematic. It was trying to push you in a direction, and when the game opens up, it kind of throws a bit of that out, and you start to see what the entire game would have ended up looking at. Grand Pulse, when you end up getting to the open world sections of the game, is not visually impressive all that much. There's actually a lot of kind of downfalls inside of it as well, in all design aspects. And having the entire game open like that actually would have been hugely detrimental to the game. And it was obviously designed to be linear, and that is fairly disappointing in some aspects. I will say at the same time, I kind of like the linearity, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And that's my main two complaints. Obviously, I have a bunch of smaller complaints as well, such as, main character dies, the character that's leading, that you're playing as, you can only control one character, and when they die, the game's over. It's like, yay, okay. They fixed that in Final Fantasy XIII too, and stuff like that. And then the AI sometimes is very, very obnoxious. The stagger system sometimes doesn't necessarily work in the way that you would like it to. You have to focus on paradigms a lot, which is actually a strategic advantage that I actually enjoy about the game. But at the same time, because of AI alterations, you have to learn how to kind of cheat the system almost. It makes it feel a little bit artificial at times, which is a bit disappointing, because you want one of these sort of games to be, you want to feel like you're in control. And in certain cases, there will be just frustrating moments to where you don't feel like you're in control, which is, once again, not something you want to experience. And so, yeah, also, I'm picking up items, and I don't know why, because I'm not going to need any of them, but whatever, we'll just keep going. It also doesn't have a New Game Plus, which also frustrates me, because when a linear game is very, very linear, I kind of want an experience to where I can be like, oh, well, I want to go through this again, I want to see these areas again, and then you'll never be able to visit them again, which is fairly unfortunate. But that's my main complaints. And so basically, that's kind of where I stand. I do enjoy the game, and it does have a lot of smaller problems, as I was talking about. But at the same time, I kind of want to focus on the major complaints of the game and kind of talk about some misconceptions about the way that the game is, and misconceptions about Final Fantasy as well, because everyone kind of has this idea that Final Fantasy games are somehow perfect products. I cannot remember a single Final Fantasy that I've thought like, wow, this is a perfect product. They've all had flaws, every single one of them. Now 13, because of that cinematic approach, I feel like it actually has some very large major flaws, and they're very much more apparent, such as the linearity of it. Final Fantasy games, talking about linearity at first, because this is the biggest complaint that I end up seeing people talking about when they talk about 13. They're like, oh yeah, well 13 is really, really linear, and I don't like linear games. The reality is you probably would hate most Final Fantasy games, like very, very few Final Fantasy games. No numbered Final Fantasy game is not linear. What they actually have is they have an open world in most of these games. And so basically they'd have an open world, and it's like, oh, well, you can go here and you could go here, wherever you want. But the reality is the story's linear. you get one set of directions and that's pretty much where you can go. And most of them end up locking up the past stuff as well. And so it's like, oh, well, there you go. And then at the end of the game, about 80% through, you get something that's like, oh, well, now the world's open and you get these extra challenges, which is how it's always been. And it's been that way since the 2D Final Fantasy, since I can remember. Even Final Fantasy I, the very, very first one, was still very, very linear. And sure, the other games did have more sort of stuff to do on the side. I will say that 13, since it was kind of focusing on that main story and that main cinematic, it didn't really have a lot of extra stuff there until the very end, to where you get that sort of hunt stuff. And even that is still kind of lackluster in the way of sort of extra content, as in kind of like building the world and stuff like that. And once again, that is my major complaint, is the world building. You know, it does run into that problem to where it doesn't feel like it's kind of building that world. Whereas in other Final Fantasies, you know, people love to talk about Blitzball in Final Fantasy X, even though I thought it was a really annoying minigame when I got to it. It's one of those things to where it's just like, you know, those games like to split it up a little bit. And so it felt a little bit more open. But the reality is, Final Fantasy has always been an extremely linear series. Even Final Fantasy VII, that people love to praise, that I still don't really understand to this day, and I don't feel like it held up very well. It's still a game that was very, very linear. You go from one town to the next, and there's nothing in between. Sure, you can go to the casino area and like do chocobo races and stuff like that, but it really doesn't have any positive value to it whatsoever. And so it's one of those cases to where it doesn't really do much, and the main story is still very linear. And yes, Final Fantasy XIII could definitely do a better job of sort of splitting that up, and they do a better job in 13.2, and 13.3 is just a complete sandbox, which I don't feel necessarily worked, but that's a topic for another video. It's one of those cases to where, yes, they could have improved it, and they could have done a better job of immersing you inside of that world, and they do a lot of transparency things, such as the mini-map, which is literally just like a straight line 90% of the game. They could have done a better job with that. They could have made it so that the mini-map looked larger. They could have made it so that you visit more towns and more locations. And although that doesn't necessarily make sense in the story, I feel like they could have at least tried to ham-fist things a little bit. They do try to change things up a little bit here and there, to where like, oh, here's a little mini-game and things like that. But at the same time, those mini-games feel a little bit threadbare in a lot of cases. And it's like, all right, well, I'm going to do this for 5 seconds and then move on with my life. And that's kind of how it ends up going, which, once again, doesn't really play into the whole Final Fantasy feel that we're used to in games like, let's say, Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IX, to where it's like, oh, Final Fantasy IX, you're on a stage and you have this whole big cutscene thing and you have this little mini game and stuff like that. And they did that sort of thing to break things up. Final Fantasy XIII doesn't do that. And I feel like it's better for it because it makes it so it focuses on that story. I like that sort of linear experience. And I don't mind that it's a linear corridor. It does actually come into a positive to where the game is incredibly well balanced. Like, the game actually limits you on your level cap. And I remember one friend that I had back in the day who was actually complaining about this. He's like, I really love to power level and just power through for the story. So at the very beginning of the game, he just kind of chills out and grinds for a bit. And that's kind of what he does. And that's perfectly respectable. I could actually see doing that because he just wants the story. That's what he's in for. And so he just grinds for it and stuff like that. But he's like, oh, I can't do that in 13 because basically the game only allows you to level up to a certain point. And the reason is they actually set the exact amount of enemies and the exact amount of experience you're going to need to finish a fight between each fight. And so basically the boss fights are actually able to have a cap difficulty, and it'll be like, oh, well, they're only going to be this difficult, or they're only going to be this easy. And you're able to kind of have to use strategies instead of actually just being like, oh, well, I'm level 99. I don't care about this level 10 boss. I'm just going to absolutely destroy it. Which is a problem that I ran into in other Final Fantasies. And Final Fantasy X specifically, one of the reasons why I actually don't really like it all that much is it's balanced absolutely terribly. Unlike 13, which, you know, 13 actually designs its bosses very, very well, to where it's like there's specific strategies and specific ways to kind of beat the bosses. And Final Fantasy X and other ones like it was kind of like, oh, well, here's one specific set, and basically you just hit attack over and over again. And it's not necessarily original. And Final Fantasy XIII, since it is linear, it's able to kind of do these sort of set pieces and be like, oh, well, this is specifically what's going to happen in this specific set. And they're able to kind of heighten emotions and heighten the drama and heighten everything else and kind of make it seem a little bit more epic than it really is. And they're able to introduce interesting mechanics. Now, this does run into the other complaint that you end up hearing a lot, to where the game is just a giant tutorial. The game is constantly throwing new mechanics at you. And as we've seen in the background, basically we haven't really gotten many new mechanics. But as you've seen, I'm already through about what would be an hour to 2 hours of the game. At least 2 hours. Yeah, so this is about an hour and a half through the game, and we've gotten to it in 14 and a half minutes with me barely paying attention. But the reality here is that most of the beginning of the game is actually a lot of cutscenes. And so people talk about, oh, it's a 20-hour tutorial. The reality is that 20 hours that you're going to be spending at the beginning of the game is actually about, I think it was about 40 minutes of gameplay when I was just skipping all the cutscenes and actually playing seriously. I keep trying to like go to save, but I don't actually want to save. So that's a little bit annoying. But yeah, it's only about like 40 minutes of gameplay. And so like 40 minutes into a game, if you end up learning all the strategies and stuff like that into a 60-hour game, that's not too bad. And so what they ended up doing is they just kind of front loaded the experience a lot with the whole cutscenes and things like that. And that once again goes into my main complaint to where, once again, it's all talking about being that, whole cinematic experience, trying to show off what the tech can do and everything. And it really hurt the game in a lot of ways. And that is definitely one of them, I feel. But at the same time, once again, it is kind of justified. I do understand that the game doesn't really open up until about that 20-hour point, and that's about where you're at Lightning getting your first Eidolon and everything. And so basically when that ends up happening, you're like, oh my god. And then all of a sudden this game just like opens up mechanically just like crazy. It's like, oh, well, here's like 20 new mechanics. And it's like, oh my god. And then you actually feel like you're using the strategy. Like right now, all I'm doing is just spamming attack over and over again, which is fairly Final Fantasy fare, I would say. I can't think of a Final Fantasy that I haven't just spammed attack in, like the core franchise at least, spin-offs and stuff like that. Obviously I do other things, but this, basically in every Final Fantasy I can just think of like, oh, I'm just spamming attack. This is the first Final Fantasy to where I actually felt like I was using genuine strategy when I actually got into the game. Maybe the other exception would be Final Fantasy XII, I would say a little bit. I used a little bit more of the Gambit system and trying to messing with the AI. I wish this game actually had a Gambit system as well. That would have fixed a lot of problems with it as well. And so, yeah, once again, tutorial, yeah, it's not really a 20-hour tutorial. It's more of just good game design to where they're like, we don't want to front load all of this sort of mechanics and everything like that into the first 5 minutes of the game. It also doesn't make sense story-wise. At the beginning of this game, you're not actually the magic-empowered, infused superheroes that you are later in the game. And so having those abilities at the beginning of the game and those mechanics would not make sense. And so they actually have to go through a lot of story to explain why you have all of those things. And so basically, it just takes too long to actually get through all of that, which is fairly frustrating. Now let's go ahead and talk about characters. So bland characters. Now I did talk about one of the sort of problems with the main characters at the beginning of this video. I was talking about my main complaints, and it goes into the whole idea that it is drowned out a little bit, like with the whole world building and everything, and things are kind of done in a very linear fashion, but they're also done in sort of set pieces. And so it'd be like, oh, well, these two characters are going to get their character development now, and then these two characters, or this character, or this part of the world, or this storytelling aspect. And this is where the characters kind of make a huge hit. Now, obviously, characters going to be 100% subjective. Sometimes you're going to like characters, sometimes they're not. There's going to be some people that absolutely hate the character Snow that I'm playing right now. There are people that absolutely love hating on Snow. I think Snow is an okay character. I think he's kind of a dick in 13 too, but at the same time, he's an alright character when it comes down to actual characters, and he does actually get a lot of character development in this game, specifically, and the other ones as well. And so it's one of those cases to where, yeah, he's actually a fairly respectable character by the end of the game, but I can see why he's seen as kind of a douche at the beginning of the game. And most people kind of say all the characters look like douches because they all have an objective, but they don't explain that objective right away. And so Snow, at the beginning of this game, not to spoil it too much, we're literally like 20 minutes into the game right now, basically, he's trying to be this hero. He's like, I'm a hero guy, and I'm going to go through and save everyone sort of thing. And that's kind of like his whole deal. And that's his whole motto is like, I'm a hero, and that's kind of his mentality for the first half of the game. But then after he gets his whole, character shift, I'm not going to spoil it, but he does change his outlook, and his character does change in general. And that's something that happens to all the characters as well. And I don't know if a lot of people ended up giving it a chance. Now, if you do slightly like the characters, my main draw to the characters actually wasn't the characters themselves, but was rather the idea that they all had an objective, which was very, very strange for a Final Fantasy, because most Final Fantasies literally go down the main path of, we have one objective, and it's the fact that evil is in the world and we need to stop it. That's literally been the plot of every single Final Fantasy before Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII was the first one to where we're like, we have a different storyline on, prepared. It's like, this guy wants to be a pirate. That's basically the entire beginning of the story. And so it kind of hinges off of that. And yes, there's an evil empire and everything like that and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's really, really interesting for the fact that 13 decided to keep with that trend. They're like, oh, hey, we're going to do this different thing. And they actually made it so that, this is one of the most important aspects that I actually liked about the beginning of the Final Fantasy XIII story, and why I actually drew to the characters so quickly, is the fact that they don't like each other. The game starts off with a band of characters that are not necessarily friends of each other. They're like, yeah, you know what? I'm working with you because basically these scenarios that we're set in are actually cases to where basically, yeah, we kind of have to work together. Otherwise, we're literally just going to get shot in the face and die because they're hunted like animals. Obviously, not going to spoil it, but it's literally at the beginning of the game, once again, before that 20-hour mark. And so basically, they have to work together because of the circumstances they're put in. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And while I wasn't a fan of all the characters, I still felt like there was enough warrant to end up going through with it. And I was happy that I did, because I did enjoy the characters later on. And you get a lot of character development, and you learn that every single character has their motives, and they all have an objective in the end, and that's what they're kind of working towards. The game does a terrible job of explaining that during the beginning, and I feel like that is a huge detriment to it. And maybe some people will end up not looking past that, and some people, once again, the story is kind of hard to follow, and so especially when the game first came out, there was a lot of people like, I have no clue what's going on right now. And that is perfectly understandable. Also, I realized that in the background, I should have been using hand grenades through that entire thing, and I could have gotten through this about 5 minutes faster. But at the same time, screw that, I'm talking. So yeah, I apologize for that. For anybody who's like actually a super fan of Final Fantasy XIII and knows how to speedrun this game, yeah, I know I'm not playing optimally in the background. I'm just kind of using it as background footage to talk. So yeah, what are other complaints about it? Let's go ahead and talk about the difficulty of the game, because this is a very interesting one to where I've actually seen it go between the absolutely extreme and absolutely abysmal. So basically, people actually had a huge fit over the fact of auto battle. You'll actually see it here. And in the settings, I actually had to set it so it would go to the abilities first, because I like going through the menus and being able to select, and I like it being quicker. But I can just click auto battle. And what it will do is it will set up a certain amount of abilities and give a suggested target. And so people were like, oh, well, it has auto battle, so the game will literally play itself. The thing is, the game actually has a fairly in-depth system, and everyone that was saying that the game was too easy never actually got halfway through the game. And it was quite obvious because they'd never talk about the paradigm system, which is actually fairly important in the game. And that's actually where the strategy comes into play. You know how most Final Fantasies in the past, like let's say Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VI even, like 6 was a fantastic game, but at the same time, it still ran into this problem to where 90% of the time, you're literally sitting there clicking attack, 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 switch target, attack, use heal spell, attack, and it's just, you do that over and over again, and it ends up being just the same thing over and over again. But this game, while we haven't gotten to it in this footage, and once again, you're seeing where that 20-hour tutorial thing comes into play, and once again, that is a huge detriment to the game. It is a problem, and I wish it was ended up fixing it, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense story-wise, so right now we're going through a bunch of story. I've skipped about like 6 hours of cutscenes at this point. This is like almost the end of disc 1, but at the same time, you know, it goes into that problem to where, yeah, the paradigm system, at first, you have no idea it even exists, but once you actually get towards that story bit and you're actually at that point to where it's like, oh, hey, this is actually a mechanic of the game, that's where the depth comes into play. And this is the first Final Fantasy that I was able to play. Even Final Fantasy XII was mostly like just sit there and wait for timers to run out and use that gambit system. But at the same time, it still felt like you were just kind of spamming the same thing over and over again. Also, I think we're about to do it now. Oh, wait, no, I got one other stage, and then basically we fight a boss, and then I get the gambit system, or not the gambit system, the paradigm system. But basically, this is the first Final Fantasy game that I played to where it was like, oh no, I got 3 stages left. God, you know, sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what you're going through when you're not watching the cutscenes, because I remember the cutscenes, not necessarily the gameplay. Once again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But once again, going into it, you know, that paradigm system makes it so that you actually have to pay attention to what you're doing in game, and it actually goes into that strategy I was talking about with bosses. And so bosses actually have a specific strategy, and so it's like, oh, well, I need to use this specific style of gameplay to actually defeat this boss, and you actually have to set up paradigms and you have to customize it and stuff like that. And yeah, once again, that is actually where the depth comes into play. Now, the leveling system is fairly linear as well. You literally just go into nodes and basically level them linearly. Maybe I'll load up one of my saves just to show off some of those systems, but for the most part, it ends up being just very, very linear in general, which is also very unfortunate, and people ended up not liking the lack of customization in the game as well. The game doesn't have a lot of customization until very, very late in the game, to where you end up getting the upgrade system, which is where you're able to upgrade specific weapons. However, this game also doesn't have, you know, gale drops and stuff like that. And so basically you don't get money from battles. And so basically you have to use resources that you're getting from these linear battles to end up upgrading these weapons, which means that you're not going to be upgrading weapons for a very, very long time because there's a limited number of battles. Now, you can technically, at any point that you end up getting into a boss, you can just backtrack a small amount and grind a little bit to end up getting a little bit of more experience and a little bit more materials and stuff like that. So there is somewhat of a grinding aspect, but at the same time, it expects you to use that strategy and use those abilities that you kind of built up in your playthrough and build the items that you've had and upgrade them to actually complete each objective, which is fairly interesting in my perspective. But at the same time, I definitely agree with the lack of customization. The leveling system isn't really improved in any of the 13 games except for Lightning Returns, to where they ended up having a really in-depth weapon upgrade system, but it was still locked behind a New Game Plus system, which was fairly weird. But at the same time, I perfectly understand that. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I mean, it's better than just you're level 2. Instead, what you do is you get these points and you spend these points on a skill tree that's just very, very linear. And there's sort of off branches. So you could choose to spend that experience to level up one ability, and you can choose what class to level up. And so it'll be like, oh, well, I want this person to be a melee kind of commando fighter, or I want this character to be a Ravager, which is the magic class. And the other interesting thing about this is the fact that they actually add in depth to this paradigm system because each different role actually has different benefits, and they actually have a stagger system as well. And so when you're fighting enemies, you'll actually see that there's a stagger bar, and you're able to use this paradigm system to benefit off of that. And once again, going into the combat depth. So there is actually a lot of depth, and some people actually saw this as a negative, and where they're like, oh, well, the game's too difficult. And they actually found the fact of the lack of customization and the lack of difficulty. Once again, I'm kind of drawing it all back in. Sorry if it sounded like I went off chain a little bit. But they found the lack of customization, the lack of being able to really grind all that much to be making the game way too difficult. Now, in later editions of the game, they did add in an easy mode, which you actually saw at the beginning of this video, to where we're at the main menu and you can actually go to easy mode, which actually makes the game fairly easy. You could probably finish it on auto battle eventually if you're on easy mode, because it's super easy on easy mode. But normal mode is what I normally expect to play through. And oh god, we're on Hope. Don't worry, we're about to talk about him. So yeah, once again, people saying that the game is too challenging. And I would say this is probably one of the more difficult Final Fantasy games, because it is one of those cases to where you can't just grind your way over it. And so I thought that was very, very interesting. I think the only games in Final Fantasy kind of history that I've ever actually had any sort of problems with were games that are not numbered Final Fantasies. I've always found Final Fantasy to be almost too easy. It's just like, oh, I'm having trouble with this. I'll just level up once or twice or something like that, and then it's perfectly fine and easy, which is a problem with JRPGs in general. And 13 does some things to kind of fix that. At the same time, execution isn't perfect. It is a little bit too linear, and the customization is a little bit more obscure and takes way too long to get to, which is a general complaint in the game, once again, from the very beginning of the 20-hour tutorial thing, to where you don't get those mechanics until much later in the game. And there's no reason not to have the weapon upgrade system like at the beginning of the game. I thought it would have been perfectly fine to introduce that at the very start. That would have actually been perfectly fine, but at the same time, they probably didn't want you wasting your resources on weapons that you get at the very beginning of the game, just in case you wanted to do something else, and they don't want to lock people into, ideas and things like that. Whoops, I did not want to go to quit. I thought I was skipping a cutscene, but I was not. Here's a little bit more of the open stuff. We do get some multiple pathways as well when you end up going through the game and stuff like that, so it is kind of nice to actually have that. But let's go ahead and go into the final kind of critique thing that I'm going to go into. And one, obviously graphics and stuff like that. Some people complain about the graphics and things. I personally like the visual style, and I don't mind the kind of look of it. I think that the 360 PS3 era is probably the last era where we're going to see games that will hold up for a very long time. Final Fantasy XIII is starting to look pretty dated, and you can definitely see it, especially when you get into some of the larger areas. You start seeing a lot of the cases where it's like, all right, they had to cut some corners here to get it kind of working. You're probably noticing some stuttering here and there because the CPU thread is maxing out right now because I'm capturing at the same time, and it's deciding to use the same CPU thread for whatever reason. So sorry for that. Sorry if the gameplay in the background starts stuttering like crazy. But let's talk about the final main criticism I'm going to talk about in this video, and that is the fact of blandness. A lot of people found Final Fantasy XIII to be bland, and they found it really hard to get into. This is probably the biggest problem with most people liking Final Fantasy XIII, is the fact that it can feel bland to people that don't enjoy it. It is one of those games that is going to be 100% subjective. You're either going to like it or you're not. And that's just the way it works with literally every single game. And Final Fantasy has always been a franchise that has been looked at as sort of this huge, giant kind of franchise that is absolutely perfect and everything. I talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the video, but it's one of those franchises that I don't necessarily get the whole fan base around, because some people are like, oh, I'm a huge fan of Final Fantasy, but I hate half of them. And that's understandable. Like, I like most Final Fantasy games, but at the same time, I don't like half of them. It's one of those franchises where every single game ends up doing something different. And if you don't like what they changed in Final Fantasy XIII, you might not enjoy it. And that is perfectly fine. However, the game can feel bland for some people, and that mostly comes down to the characters and sort of the things that I've talked about in this video, and the fact that there are certain characters that people are not going to gel with. The two characters that I'm playing right now are literally the two main characters that I'm going to be talking about for this problem, because Vanille is that sort of stereotypical kind of JRPG, very lighthearted and happy and joyful. She does change near the later game, but at the same time won't spoil it. And she's very, very high-pitched and everything. She's like, yay, all happy and hippie and everything. And a lot of people don't like that. And then Hope. He's an annoying little child that doesn't have any sort of character development until halfway through the game. And so he's really freaking annoying for the first half of the game. He spends it entirely complaining, which is very, very annoying to some people. And people can find that in a very, very negative tone. They use that to kind of criticize the rest of the game as well and use it to ignore other complaints about the game as well, or other positives as well. And so they're looking at it and being like, oh, hey, you know, you can do this other thing. Oh, yeah, there's these things that I can use, like, whoa, special buffs. Now I get buffs when I start this fight. Yay. Sorry, there's other mechanics I'm just running into. Once again, you know, you learn mechanics as you're going through the game, which is actually a good thing, but at the same time, it's kind of annoying. And that's another thing that can be bland about the game, is that it doesn't do anything special. It is mainly focusing on a very serious story. It doesn't have anything that's going to be like chuckling you up and stuff like that. It does have some comical moments here and there, especially with Saz. Saz and his bird are the absolute best thing in this game just because they're awesome. I remember I have a friend that absolutely loves Saz for everything that he is. And it's actually quite great because at one point in the game where something bad happened, he's like, oh no! And he stopped playing the game because he thought something worse happened than what actually did. And I thought it was hilarious because I actually killed the game for him because Saz was so awesome, which was hilarious. But it's going to break down completely to subjectiveness. And one thing that I kind of want to say here is that if you're somebody who doesn't like Final Fantasy XIII and you're for some reason still watching this and thinking, wow, this guy's an idiot and I want to absolutely hate on him, you shouldn't hate on people that like something that you don't. In fact, you should be jealous. Because it's not the fact of like, oh, you should be jealous because Final Fantasy XIII is a great game. It's not. It's a good game. It's not a great game. It has its flaws, literally like every single other Final Fantasy. It's not a perfect product, and it has a lot of problems with it. And there's a lot of problems, even though I absolutely love the game, and it's my favorite numbered Final Fantasy so far. It is one of those cases to where it does have its problems, and it does have a lot of things that people are just not going to outright like. And that's going to be a problem with literally every single game. And you should probably be jealous just because somebody is able to enjoy something that you're not. When I look at something and I'm like, oh man, you know, like let's say Final Fantasy X, for example. Everyone's like, I love Final Fantasy X. It's the greatest Final Fantasy ever made and stuff like that. And I go play it and I get super bored. I just don't like it. I find it bland, unentertaining. I don't like the characters. I think the combat is boring and I just can't enjoy it. But I don't look at that and be like, oh, well, everyone who likes Final Fantasy X is an idiot. No, I look at that and I'm like, hey, they're able to enjoy this game that I can't find enjoyment out of. And I've tried over and over again to enjoy that game, and I can't. And it's one of those cases where it's like my subjective tastes and my objective tastes do not fall in line. I have it on PC now, and it has problems on PC, which is fairly annoying to work through. But when I get through those, it's like, oh, well, now I just don't actually like the game. And it's like, oh, it wasn't just the technical problems. It's actually just I don't like the game. It's not a bad game. It's actually a good game. It has a lot of positive aspects to it, just like every other game. But at the same time, it's a flawed product. And once again, people shouldn't be so negative about it. People should be able to look at games and be like, oh, hey, you know, you're able to enjoy this thing that I don't. That's great. That's fantastic. Because if I could look at every single game and be like, I enjoy this, I would love life. That would be absolutely fantastic. If I could look at every single JRPG and be like, oh my God, I want to play all of these and I absolutely enjoy every single one of them, that'd be fantastic. If there was franchises that I could look at and be like, oh, every single one in this game and this franchise is perfect, that'd be great. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I do have objective and subjective tastes. There are things where, like, let's say low frame rates, for example. I can't play a game that's running at like 30 FPS for very long. It literally makes it so that I objectively cannot play the game for very long because it makes me dizzy. It hurts my eyes. I get eye fatigue very, very quickly. And so I can't play the game for extended periods of time. Sure, I can deal with frame drops here and there, and some menu-based games are easy to kind of rest your eyes on and stuff like that. And so it does vary game to game. But that is an objective problem to where I can't play. I can't play games with obsessive bloom because, once again, blurs the vision and it just is unpleasant to play. Or there's subjective tastes, such as I don't like specific characters. I don't like characters that are really, really whiny for no reason. I don't like characters that have no objective. I hate the idea of a hero's tale to where it's like the entire beginning of the story is like, we're a hero and we're out to save the world, and it doesn't do anything to ever change it up. This is the reason why I didn't really like Tales of Zestiria. My review absolutely hammered that point to where I'm like, I just don't like it because it literally has nothing interesting going on. And that, once again, I love the combat system in that game. I love the characters, but at the same time, the entire main arc was all about this hero's tale, and that's not something I personally enjoy. However, other people might. And so once again, Final Fantasy XIII as a franchise, it does have 3 games, and to kind of touch on the other ones, they do change it up quite a bit. And a lot of people like to focus on the main one, Final Fantasy XIII, but the fans actually like 13.2 and Lightning Returns and things like that. And there's actually varying opinions on each one. And it's an interesting study. And I don't necessarily know why it ended up having such a toxic following. I still don't understand the negative hate towards any Sonic game that has ever existed, where people are just like, yeah, it's a Sonic game, I gotta hate it. And it seems like that's the same thing with Final Fantasy. We saw it pick up with Final Fantasy 15 releasing it as well. So we ended up seeing it. Is it 15? 15 is the new one, right? Yes, 15 is the new one. 14 is the MMO. Sorry, I get the numbers mixed up sometimes because the MMOs kind of throw them off a little bit. But we saw it with 15 as well. Some people were just like, oh, I hate 15. It's a terrible game and it's absolutely terrible and the story is crap. Why is anybody ever enjoying this game? And I'm like, no. For one, I can't play it because I don't have a console. But at the same time, it looks like a game that I won't enjoy. My friend, who has been playing it like crazy over the last while, has been telling me like, yeah, I don't think you'd actually like this game because I like the linear experiences and I like the sort of kind of told tales and cinematic experiences that they actually introduce in a lot of JRPGs, and I enjoy that aspect to them. Sure, I like a little bit of openness, I like being able to explore and things like that, and I like the world building that they have in that, but at the same time, in Final Fantasy XV, it's a completely open world, and it feels more Western, and my friend's like, yeah, you don't really like a lot of Western RPGs, so you might not actually enjoy this one. It's very strange. It's kind of like the same reason why I don't really like The Witcher 3, and once again, it all goes down to those subjective tastes, and every single game is going to be different. 13.2 ends up being a lot more open. They ended up fixing a lot of the problems with that. They did kind of tone down the amount of world that they have in it, but they did a lot better job of world telling, like world building. And so they're like, oh, hey, this is how specific aspects of the world work by doing sort of side quests, which the side quests were mostly uninspired things like go kill this or go collect that, which was meh, or go solve this many puzzles is like meh. But at the same time, it kind of had more open world. It was all free roaming. They actually had a new game plus system that was really, really interesting. Getting the alternate endings was really freaking cool. And 13.3, which is Lightning Returns, was a very, very interesting. And so basically, it's a complete sandbox game, toned down world like crazy. It only has like 3 or 4 open areas. I can't remember exactly. I have a review on it on my channel if you want to look at it. But that game was very, very different. But you only control Lightning. So it's the first Final Fantasy game that I could think of in the numbered history that actually only has one main character, which was very, very interesting. So basically you control her and it's more action-oriented combat. And it's actually really, really fun, really interesting. But the story aspects as well are very, very slimmed down. And it's all just free exploration and all side quests, which was something that I was not pleased with. But at the same time, it was a nice closure to the 13 and the gameplay was enough for me to enjoy it. But at the same time, they're all different games, and different people are going to enjoy them. People that enjoyed 13 might not actually like 13.2 or 13.3, which is, once again, an interesting aspect. So, yeah, so to kind of close this off, you know, the hate towards 13, sure, you might not like it, but I think the absolutely hate, especially the toxicity towards the fan base, is not warranted at all. And I think all the toxicity, especially the death threats I talked about, like, just absolutely insane. Like, just absolutely crazy that people get that obsessive over hating something. They're like, hey, I hate this thing so much, I'm literally going to cause threats to people. That's stupid. But for the most part, it's not a bad game. It's just a game that's heavily flawed. And every single Final Fantasy has had these flaws. And so, yeah, it's just every single game is going to have different problems. And maybe some people are able to overlook them. Maybe others aren't. And if you still haven't played 13, I recommend it as an experience. It's not that much. It's on PC. It's pretty cheap. It's like under $20. And so, yeah, it's a nice 60-hour RPG. It does run like garbage, though, on PC. It is absolutely terrible. So if you don't have a decent CPU, don't expect to run it above 30 FPS. You're going to get 30 FPS with dips at 20, and that's about it. I'm running on a 6700K right now for an i7 Intel, and it still dips here and there. Mostly that's because I'm recording right now, but for the most part, it runs pretty smooth, I would say. I have a GTX 1070 as well, but it's mostly CPU-bound problems. It does have some graphical glitches as well to where the hair stutters over and everything like that. And this kind of ended up turning into a review almost. But regardless, anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this one. This one kind of ran on a little bit longer than I was originally planning on, but that's how these go. I just kind of like rambling on and I wanted to talk about it quite a bit. And I'm fairly passionate about the topic as well. And it's not just Final Fantasy XIII, it's other games as well. Games are not a linear progression of being like, this is good and this is bad. There are no good, there are no bad games. There are games that are just subjectively good and subjectively bad. And there are some that some people will enjoy and some others won't. Now, there are, objectively bad games. I shouldn't say that there aren't, because there are some games that are literally just terrible, like bad design and things like that can play huge parts in that. However, games like, let's say, Final Fantasy XIII, for example, while it may not be to everyone's tastes, it's not a bad game. So give it some slack. Cut it some slack and don't be so toxic towards the fan base. And if you are somebody that likes 13, make sure to leave those thoughts in the comments. Maybe there's something I missed. Maybe you're somebody who tried 13 and didn't like it. Make sure to leave those thoughts in the comments as well. Obviously, the gameplay in the background that I've been playing has been Final Fantasy XIII. I haven't been playing optimally, so don't really worry. It has a bunch of mechanics. If I actually ever did a full review of this, I'd talk about it more in depth, but I don't think it's really worth it at this point. Tons of thoughts out there on 13, but most of them end up being negative. Even if you look up reviews today, people are still making new reviews about it and still following that sort of hate train. And I understand a lot of the complaints. Obviously, most of this video was just talking about complaints, and I have a lot of complaints about this game because I like it so much. I want it to be so much better, but at the same time, it's a game that's never going to change because it's had its release, it's had its heyday. They've released 2 other games in it, and so it's pretty much done and dead, which is unfortunate because I would have loved this game to be like kind of redone and remade, but that won't happen for another... How long has Final Fantasy VII Remake been in works? Yeah, it's going to be a while. Anyways, like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. And if you have any other topics for Design View, make sure to leave them in the comments as well. Maybe I can analyze some other types of games and do this sort of... This kind of ended up being like a pseudo review and more talking about what other people's opinions are rather than just my own, which I feel like is kind of an interesting kind of topic point, and I might end up doing a few more of these in the future on different types of games. So if you have a game that maybe you've seen on the channel or maybe that you personally liked and you may think that I might enjoy, make sure to leave those in the comments and maybe I can end up doing one of those on that one. So anyways, like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. I have a bear on my back. That's Snow. His weapon is literally just like badges on his back. You see he doesn't have his weapon out right now, and so basically he has nothing on his coat. But when he has a weapon on, he uses his fist to punch things. And so instead of actually giving him like knuckles or a fist or something like that, they just put it so he has emblems on the back of his coat and you get a dragon at one point. I like that weapon.